Believe it or not, my first visit to the Conservatory Lab Charter School, so in that sense, how many of you was it your first visit? Okay, most of you. So we're in the same boat. As Diana mentioned, I am married to Ellen Ringer, who was on the board here, and is scientific research here, and I know something about L6 and about expeditionary learning. So in that sense, I'm probably about the same place as those of you who were here once, but just once before, right? I'm not exactly a freshman, but I'm not quite ready to be a sophomore. By the end of the day, you're going to know more about the school, about the program than I do, and so I'm not going to pretend to discuss what's happening here today, both figuratively and literally. That's what you're here for. I thought that instead what I would do, and I declined to bring PowerPoint slides, but as soon as I saw a flip chart, I said I got to write down something because I'm a teacher. I'll say just a bit about my own background, something about multiple intelligence theory, something about minds of the future. Those are both books. Then a couple remarks about instrumentality. I'll tell you what I mean by that. And I should be done in 20 to 30 minutes, and I'm happy to take questions and comments. I did want to say that music has been a very important part of my life from very early on. I was quite a serious pianist, and I'm actually living in Cambridge, and you all have a sense of what that means. How many people are actually musicians, even though now you never know it, because we don't do that sort of thing. And it's probably not an accident. I think having music in your life is very important for many people, and I still, the arts are very important for me, listening to music, and when nobody's around playing, because I would not subject anybody else to my playing anymore. When I play, I listen to how I wish it sounded, rather than how it does sound, but it still is something that's part of my bloodstream. I will say though, and I don't mean this at all to be critical of the school, I think there are lots of ways to be well educated, and I don't think music is an essential. But I think for those of us who have a musical inclination, as I do, it's a wonderful way into learning more generally. And I certainly would have a much poorer life if it hadn't been so much a part of my own upbringing. And when I started to work as a psychologist, when I was a graduate student at Harvard, literally 45 years ago, I was struck by the fact that within academic psychology in America at that time, there was essentially no interest whatsoever in the arts, and that's any art form: dance, music, drawing, drama, etc. In fact, if you went into a psychology textbook 45 years ago and you looked up the word art, you wouldn't find it there at all. And this is different from Europe. In Europe, the arts are much more part of your training, and not just practically. When we had drawing here 100 years ago, it was to prepare you for manual arts, but as far as what it means to be an educated person. And as Danny mentioned, I do come from a European background, so for me, it was surprising how underplayed anything artistic was in the world of psychology. And so I was incredibly lucky that at that time, 46 years ago, 1967, 45 years ago, at the Graduate School of Education at Harvard, they started a project called Project Zero, and I was actually a founding member of that project. I'm now a senior director, you know what that means. Very senior. But those of you who've heard of Project Zero will know that while we now do all sorts of things in K through 12 education, in museums and in other kinds of tertiary institutions, the arts have always been a very important part of Project Zero, and almost anybody who works at Project Zero is usually a kind of a crypto artist, whether or not they reveal it. It usually comes out. It's probably also because of my own interest in music and other art forms that when I began to study intelligence, I was on the lookout for forms of thinking which might not be adequately appreciated in the country at that time. So, if you know anything about my work at all, you know I'm the MI man. 30 years ago I proposed that intellect, instead of being one thing, was better thought of as a number of different capacities. The best, very simple introduction to MI theory is traditional intelligence theory says we have one computer inside our skull. If it works well, you're smart at everything. If it works average, you're average at everything. If it works slow, you're out of luck. But I did a lot of research and thinking, and I now believe we have anywhere from 7 to a dozen different computers in the head. That's how God and nature and the brain evolved. And what IQ tests typically measure are skill in language and logic. Nobody would say that's unimportant, but MI theory recognizes musical, spatial, bodily, interpersonal, intrapersonal, natural, and maybe some more. I'm being very summary here. There may be an existential intelligence, the intelligence of big questions, and relevant for everybody here, there may be a pedagogical intelligence, the intelligence involved in teaching. And you think about it for a minute, you could take two musicians who are absolutely equal in skill, and one of them could teach anybody, and the other person cannot teach anyone. That's pedagogical intelligence. Now you may say, well, why don't I just say there's pedagogical intelligence? And that's because I actually have a method for determining whether something counts as an intelligence, and for the last few I'm still assembling data. So anyway, my deal working with intelligence kind of ushered in the second phase of my life where I became much more involved in education. And that's where I actually met, and you're right, it was probably about 1990 or so that we first began to work in parallel. And there are really two primary educational implications of MI theory. And it took me a long time to understand what they are. And they're individuation and pluralization. Individuation means know as much about every child as possible. And to the extent that you can teach that child, and the child can show you what he or she understands in ways that are comfortable, that education is individualized. There's one group that's always got individualized education, the wealthy, because they hire tutors. The tutor can't say, well, Prince Charles is a dodo, give me Princess Anne. The job of the tutor is to tutor whoever. But in the digital world of today, everybody can have an individualized education. That's incredibly important. Pluralization could have been done at any time in history, but involves making choices. Pluralization means when you teach something, you've got to teach it in lots of ways, not just in one way. And particularly not just lecturing as I am doing now, or not just showing a movie, but mixing and matching. And what that means, though, is you can't teach everything. You've got to decide what's really important, and then teach it graphically, artistically, through performance, through humor, through jigsaw, etc., etc. And if you teach pluralistically, or maybe if you say, if you educate pluralistically, you reach more kids, because kids don't all learn everything in the same way, but also you show what it's like to understand something. Because if you understand something well, you think about it in lots of ways. Think about your family, your home, your hobby. You can draw, you can act it out, make jokes about it, and so on. As teachers, often, we teach only one way, and if the kid doesn't learn, we think it's the kid's fault. But as, David Rose of Casper would say, often it's not the student with a learning disability, it's the curricular, which with a disability, because it only teaches something one way. So, I just saved you a lot of time, because you could read lots of books about global intelligences without having the individuation and pluralization, but that's really the heart of the matter. In more recent work, which some of you will know about, I've begun to think a lot about the kinds of minds, the kinds of skills, the kinds of understandings we need in the 21st century. In the PowerPoint era, this seems like going back to duplicating machines and carbon papers. So when I talk about the future, and this is totally background, I'm thinking about your kids. They're going to be in a world that's global. And what happens in Japan or Syria or Peru is going to affect what happens here and vice versa. You're going to live in a world that's totally digital. I can tell you that. You're going to live in a world where we know a lot about the brain and how it works, and where they can show you their gene chips and their MRIs. And if you say, well, that's not my department, you say, fine, we'll go to the doctor. You can't make sense of what's going on here. And finally, the reason we're here today, on this sunny day, is education is going to be lifelong. Learning is going to be lifelong. And while that's a cliche, it's actually very serious work, because as we move more and more into digital learning, it's going to be how well people learn things, and not whether they're in 2nd grade or 10th grade that's going to matter. And that whole, how long since begun, it won't be, but the whole configuration of buildings like this, and 2nd grade and 4th grade, that's all going to disappear as we decide where people are going to pick up different kinds of skills, at what speeds, in what way, and so on. And so the notion that somehow, in my grandparents' era, you finished high school and then you never went to school again, or in my generation, you went to college and then went to school again, that's nonsense. Education is going to begin as soon as Agnes can. She's already reaching for the iPhone, right? And my mother is over 100 and she's still teaching bridge. I mean, it's just the age grading is going to disappear. So, that's the future, your future. So I write about 5 kinds of minds, which I think we have to cultivate. And none of these is a mystery, but I've written a book and continue to think and write about these things. And I thought I would talk about a bit with reference to music, because after all, that's probably what drew you here. They're called the disciplined mind, the synthesizing mind, the creating mind, the respectful mind, and the ethical mind. The disciplined mind, music is actually a very good example, because discipline means both working at something regularly. As Deanna said, you don't pick up the fiddle every 2 weeks, it's something you do every day. And that's, to put it very bluntly, the reason certain groups in our society have risen to the top in education in different decades over the last 100 years is because of the understanding of discipline in that sense. It's not a terribly politically correct thing to say, but if you think about symphony orchestras over the last 100 years, you could indicate which groups were the most disciplined, whether it's spelling bees or chess or running or playing the fiddle. But discipline also means becoming an expert. And this is the most frightening idea. In the future, if you're not an expert in something, you're probably not going to have a job, because there's going to be a computer or an application that's going to do it better than you. So being disciplined enough to get very good at something is very, very important. And of course, music is just one of 100 things you can be good at, but the discipline of working every day, developing a skill, is just crucial. In the digital era, it's harder. It's harder because there's so many distractions. I was talking about Il Sistema yesterday to Lin Chang and Lisa Wang, who have been very involved, both musicians, and she's a pediatrician. In a sense, it's easier in Venezuela because there aren't so many distractions. Discipline doesn't do well with a lot of distractions. And you have to build up a lot of esprit. Synthesizer is making connections. And I think connected is your third term. We're all inundated with information. That's not a problem anymore. Too much information. But how do you figure out what's important? How do you connect it to other things? How do you hold it on to it? how do you spread it on, how do you share it with other people? That's crucial. In the El Sistema branch, you're working on the discipline. But when you move to expeditionary learning and some of the rich projects you're going to learn about today, those are making connections. The third is creating, doing something new. Again, the rewards are always going to be for people who can think outside the box. But I joked, you can't think outside the box unless you have a box. And the box is the discipline and the synthesizing, what I call the depth and the breadth. The rewards are for those who can stretch. And one of the sort of discouraging things about the standardization taking place in American public education today is, it may be pretty good on a certain sense of discipline, but when it gets to synthesizing and creating, that's not on the map. I did note there was something in Massachusetts regulations or legislation about innovation and creativity. It's better there than if it's not there, but how that's going to be implemented in a very crate and barrel core curriculum is, to me, still an unknown. And by the way, Massachusetts does have the best standards and exams of any state. What's interesting in the country is that the rest of the country wants to have Massachusetts quality education with Mississippi budgets. And that is going to be tragic. The last two kinds of minds have to do with the humanist sphere. And in talking to Deanna before today, she talked about the importance here of character, civics, social and emotional learning. And that's where I live now. For the last 40 years, I lived primarily with thinking and Piaget and that sort of stuff. But now I'm thinking much more about the human dimension, because that's really where our country is falling very, very badly behind. And the two kinds of minds I'll talk about are respectful and ethical. I've written at length about these kinds of minds. They're not easy to convey briefly, but let me simply say respect is how you deal with the people whom you see every day. Your parents, people in the street, your teachers, how they treat one another. And I have nothing particularly original to say about respect. It's important. I wish we had more of it. I wish we had more of it at the White House, more of it on Capitol Hill, more of it at the State House. We weren't in the State House running for anything as far as I know. We were there actually celebrating the Boston landmarks at El Sistema. But there's not a lot of positive examples of respect in the country. But ethics is about roles. Two particular roles, the citizen role and the worker role. And the ethical worker and the ethical citizen doesn't just ask about me and what's mine or what are my rights. The ethical citizen responds, and the ethical worker asks about what are my responsibilities as a teacher, an architect, an engineer, a lawyer, whatever. And again, we're very good at asserting our rights in this country. We're not very good at thinking about our responsibilities. I'm lucky enough to know Yo-Yo Ma somewhat, and he once talked about what the responsibilities of a musician are. And I have no idea whether he came up with this in 5 minutes or whether he was thinking about it for a lifetime, but it was very profound. And what he said was, number one, you have to master your instrument. That's what it means to be an expert, to be disciplined. By the way, WGBH just finished a whole month of Yo-Yo Ma celebration. It was incredible. I mean, they had 10 pieces of his on the radio every day, and interviews and so on. It's remarkable to think that he lives in our time and in our street, right, so to speak. So master things. Number two, very modern. You ought to be able to fly in somewhere, hit the ground running, and begin to perform with people whom you don't know well. Now, of course, he gives 180 concerts a year, so that's more of a problem for him than it is for some of the rest of us. But if you go to work for management consultants, not that any of us do that, any kind of place where you work on projects, you've got to be able to sit down with people you don't know and get to it quickly. The notion that you don't meet anybody except the people in the block is just not true. We live in a time of many weak ties, not a few strong ties. And the third thing, which I love, is you need to be able to pass it on. Whatever your skills are, whatever your knowledge is, the third responsibility is to pass it on. Of course, that's what we try to do as teachers. And no matter how frustrating it can be to be a teacher, and I was a piano teacher, a teacher of K1. I was a disaster at that, by the way, but I could do it. And then I went to school in Newton 42 years ago, and now I'm a teacher of students at Harvard. It's a pretty privileged setting. The ultimate reward is if you think that you can pass it on. Right? So, I think the last thing I wanted to do was say something about instrumentality. A word which I don't particularly use, but you know, El Sistema was learning how to play an instrument. And clearly, if you were in a program like this, by the end of the program, you'd be pretty good in whatever your instrument is. That's nice. It's nice to be proficient at an instrument. But when we use the word instrumental in education, we don't typically mean whether you play the flute well. What we mean is, what's the use that's going to be made of a certain skill? So you could say, well, I want to learn Latin so I can read Cicero. You know, you can read Cicero in English. It's not necessary to learn Latin. But they used to say 100 years ago, you learned Latin because it would make you more logical. And there wasn't any particular evidence that that's true, and yet many of us still like Latin, and there's no reason why you shouldn't sort of study Latin, why you shouldn't study Latin if you want to. But there's a big difference in music between three different senses of instrumentality. One sense is learning to play an instrument or learning about music because you just think that's important and that's something that every human being should have a chance to do. And I would frankly be very happy to stop there. For me, that's enough. There's a second sense of instrumental, which is, well, we want you to learn the alphabet, and it's a little bit easier to learn the alphabet if you sing A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So that's music. But frankly, that's music in a completely trivial sense. There's nothing musical about it. And if you found out tomorrow, you could learn it even better if you use body parts, then you would drop the music and you would use body parts instead. So that's what I would call the trivial use of music. And then there's a third use, which is that music shares certain properties with other areas, with other disciplines. And one of them is metrical properties. To be able to perform music, you have to understand rhythm and metrics, and not only in a sense of keeping the beat, but sometimes they're really quite complicated metrics, 3 against 4, 2 against 3, and that requires quite a high level of computation. And that's similar to understanding of fractions and equations and things like that. And that's where it's perfectly kosher to use music to help you understand mathematics, or use mathematics to help you understand music. Because there you have a common intellectual core, namely meter and rhythm. And it'd be the same thing about language, learning to sing and learning to express emotions and words and understanding about syllabification and so on is something which music shares with poetry, and you can use music singing to help you understand poetry or vice versa. So perhaps the one idea I'm bringing you here, which I haven't written about before, is when you think about music or any art form, because what I'm saying would be you should draw to be able to read better, or draw to be able to do biology better, each of which are hypotheses, we don't know if they're true or not. You need to say to yourself, are you valuing this skill for its own sake? Namely, an educated person should be able to understand, when you say hundreds of composers, they should know something about many composers, about many genres, something about how to pick a melody out. That's one sense of the instrument. The second one is, can you get a cheap ride by using something musical or something dance to learn something which is really important, but the music is just sort of an excuse to get to that place that really counts? Or have you found a genuine common intellectual core between music and some other discipline where that core can be helpful for both, and you can use music to help understand the other field, or vice versa. So I hope that that's something to keep in mind. So, in summary, while I'm not an expert in the school, I think what you're doing here is interesting, potentially important, could serve as a model. Obviously, I'm rooting for you, or I wouldn't be here today. The work in intelligences, I think, helped people realize that education isn't simply how well you're doing an IQ test or an SAT test, though those things are nice and not unimportant. And particularly as more and more stuff gets done by applications, maybe those art forms which are more difficult, those intelligences which are more difficult to create apps for, may become relatively more important. That's too easy, too early to say that. Then I talked some about the kinds of minds which I think your students will need in a globalized, digital, lifelong learning, biologically informed world. Some of them are more traditionally cognitive, others have to do more with relations between among other people, and in each case there's a way of thinking about them which connects to the curriculum here today.